Hello, good afternoon, and welcome to another Speero Sideshow. Thanks for joining. Thanks for listening. Today, we're going to be talking about the role of the Chief Revenue Officer and a little bit about the role of a Chief Growth Officer, which has some similarities, and the opportunities and challenges that these roles present for strategic cross-functional experimentation at higher levels of the business than experimentation is usually found. I'm joined today by Timi Olotu, who is Chief Revenue Officer for CharlieHR. Timi has a fantastic and interesting career, starting out as a copywriter and in creative roles before moving into more product-oriented and eventually commercial roles. Timi, thank you very much for joining. Welcome. And it would be great to just get a bit of an intro from yourself and hear a little bit in your own words about your background.
Thank you, Johnny. Great to be here. Yeah, as you mentioned, I've had quite a meandering and atypical career, a sort of dilettante of sorts, but I would say the thing that connects the thread across all the roles I've done is there is a fundamental question about cause and effect and what creates outcomes in business. And I think that's what has carried me through from being a copywriter, content marketer, launching my own software product and company, and then more commercial roles, sales, and then chief revenue officer. I think from the outside, it looks a bit random, but actually from my perspective, there's been a connecting thread through all of them, which is businesses exist to create particular outcomes. And my curiosity about how are those outcomes actually created is what's carried me through those different roles. So yeah, that's how I would think about my career journey rather than the specific job titles.
Yeah, amazing. Great. Okay, cool. Well, first thing, we're talking about the role of a Chief Revenue Officer. Just for the benefit of anyone on the call that might not understand that role, what is a Chief Revenue Officer? And I appreciate it might not be necessarily exactly the same in different companies, but what is a Chief Revenue Officer? What's your particular brand of Chief Revenue Officer?
That's a good question, a good call out as well, because historically the role of Chief Revenue Officer was occupied by a very senior sales professional, sort of career sales professional, but that's changing increasingly. We're getting marketing professionals and CS professionals achieving that role. For me, my background is more marketing heavy, but the way I would describe the role of a Chief Revenue Officer is someone who understands the commercial context of the business and formulates cross-functional strategies for becoming successful within that commercial context. That's what I'll boil it down to. So it's very sort of function agnostic. It's very expansive. And it's non-deterministic in the sense that there's not a specific set of things you look at. There's some common ones like, competitor analyses and whatever else you throw into that bucket. But really, anything that is happening commercially is within the set of things you can use to understand the terrain in which your company operates, and then what kind of strategy it needs to be successful in that terrain.
Yeah. Thank you. And Chief Growth Officer is also a fairly common term in the SaaS and product world. Do you think there's a difference between those roles, and if so, what?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think there's a sort of I think philosophically, there's probably not a difference, but in practice, there is. What I mean is the reason why those two roles exist is, in my experience, usually there's a board or an executive team or something of a company that goes, we need more revenue. who is the most high leverage person we can bring in to help us figure out that puzzle. So sometimes it comes in the shape of a chief growth officer, sometimes it comes in the shape of a chief revenue officer. However, in practice, the reason why I say it, there's often a difference is I find that chief growth officers tend to be hired from a background of product or experimentation specifically. There are certain associations that come with that. I think maybe companies that have an orientation towards technological or perceived technological mechanisms of growth will go for a chief growth officer. So they lean product and experimentation. Companies that have a more sort of people oriented, so they're thinking more in terms of we have these teams and these skills and someone to come and like use all of that to help us create growth, they lean more towards a revenue officer. But I think actually it's a whole other conversation, but I think those biases in relation to those titles are often imagined.
Yeah, I would agree. I mean, it's like I said at the beginning, that different companies are so different, aren't they? And you have very, very sales-oriented companies where a chief revenue officer is effectively a head of sales in a way, or in SaaS product companies, it's a little bit different. I'm interested a little bit more in your background as a writer. I always think it's great and fascinating when people have creative backgrounds and can bring creativity to slightly different roles. In what way would you say that sort of creative and writing background benefits the role that you do now?
It's a very good question. One that I don't get asked often enough, to my surprise. I would say it plays a huge role, actually, because what writing forces you to do is, one, clarify your own thoughts, but also simulate the thoughts and the inner experience of the person reading your words.
Yeah.
And that's actually quite important because often, I'm going to bring into the context of experimentation, what we're doing is trying to alter the causal chain of some kind. So someone lands on my website, they interact in this way, they behave, they make a decision, or they behave a certain way as a result of that interaction. But I find it's often not thought about that way. There's usually an overfixation on some aspect of experimentation, either statistical or something like that, which means we don't think about the fact that ultimately this is a sort of what we're really targeting is some kind of internal phenomenon, something we want to happen inside someone else, or we hypothesize might happen. So what writing does, or how writing has helped me, is to kind of remain tethered to the phenomenon itself rather than the method of testing or understanding it. Because when I'm writing, as a copywriter, for example, if I'm creating an ad, I'm cycling through words. It's a form of experimentation, I would say. I'm thinking of many different ways of expressing the same idea. And then I'm simulating, how might someone react to this? I'm formulating my hypotheses and I'm making decisions that way. So I think what it's done is it's helped me really stay grounded in paying attention to what the actual experience is like for, if you like, the test subject or subjects, and not getting distracted from that, trying to understand that.
Yeah. There's actually, when you really think about it, there's an incredible amount of different things within business where success boils down to being able to simplify things, isn't there? The proposition of a business and the way it's communicating to its customers, the way internal strategy is communicated and understood by different people in the business and things like that. There's a lot of it that actually comes down to the ability to really make something both simple but incredibly meaningful and clear. And, I think writing must give you an incredible ability to kind of just laser focus on understanding exactly how to get a different range of people to understand the concept easily. And you're right that is a huge part of experimentation as well, because you've got to be able to articulate an idea really clearly in order for it to then be realized and things like that. So yeah, that's really interesting. And a broad question: what does experimentation mean to you? What when the word experimentation means a lot to different people and a lot in different companies, but what does that just generally mean to you when we use that word?
Yeah, I would say so. My entry point to experimentation was actually somewhat academic and philosophical, in the sense that so I was a philosophy major for about a week, but outside of that, like during university, but outside of that, I've always been very curious and read a lot about philosophy. So my grounding is in the ideas of people like Francis Bacon and Karl Popper and stuff like that. So experimentation to me is sort of a tool within the scientific method. So for me, the goal is sort of accurate understanding and empiricism and observation. So within that frame, experimentation for me is a tool for understanding what is happening in the world and why it's happening. It's one of many tools. That's really what it boils down to. I think in a business context, there isn't a lot of appreciation or even room for that understanding of experimentation, because it almost sounds too abstract and too removed from the realities of growing revenue and getting leads or whatever it may be. But I actually think that is the most effective way of thinking about experimentation within a business. And I can talk a bit more about that, but that's the way I think about experimentation. It's a tool comprising many different components, including statistics and iteration and so on, to help us better understand what is happening in the world and why it's happening.
Yeah, that's great. I completely agree. I like to really broadly think of it as just very simply that some businesses have the advantage of having very few customers, like a handful of very high level enterprise customers. And if that's the case, you can just ring them up and talk to them. But the vast majority of businesses have an enormous number of customers that you couldn't possibly engage with. And so that kind of represents the world that you don't understand and can't understand very easily. And so all experimentation really is the fact that you can't develop things and intrinsically know that it's the right thing to do. You can't ask everybody. You can't ask 100,000 people. So experimentation is just simply the way that you seek validation and feedback from the market as to whether you're going in the right direction. I think experimentation has become incredibly confused in the business world. Starting out with CRO, which the history of which really goes back to the strange ways that consultants sold that to marketing teams in way back when. That's never really kind of gone away. And the knock-on effect is that experimentation is sort of this thing in and of itself. Like, it's seen as a tactical revenue driver. So a lot of businesses will think, well, we'll do all this stuff, and one of those things we'll do is experimentation. And so they might go, well, we've got PPC, we've got SEO, and we'll have CRO, and they think of it as a specific activity that you can pump some money into and get some money out. which doesn't really make any sense at all. And I think the exciting thing about the rise of roles like the Chief Revenue Officer and the Chief Growth Officer is that all of a sudden it can intrinsically make a lot more sense. If experimentation is aligned under that role at a more senior level, it's far easier to understand that it's just you're simply just trying things in order to figure out what's going to drive revenue or growth. So it just makes a lot more sense intrinsically, but also you're putting experimentation within a more senior, more centralized role that has the ability to then pull different levers that need to be pulled in order to run these experiments. So I mean, that's my opinion, but what's your view on that in terms of the opportunity with a role like yours?
Yeah, I feel aligned to what you said. I think I have a sort of grand hypothesis that I can't test right now, but I hope to one day, which is that the high failure rate of startups and companies in general. There are all these reasons that are put forward, co-founder disagreements, etc. And I think those reasons are real, but I think there is a sort of an order of reasons. And I think at the bottom or at the foundation, you'll find that many, I would say maybe most of these companies that die, it's because they experiment poorly. Because I think in many ways, experimentation is inevitable. The only question is whether or not you do it well. And when you think about company formation, fundamentally, it is an experiment. But the problem is most businesses refuse to acknowledge that that is the case because of hubris, because they want to believe that pure theorization. So let me just come up with possible ideas is the only way. And I would say maybe 99% of the time when I've joined a business and there's a problem, and I've developed a bit of an approach based on this, it is usually because something is happening that they don't want to be happening, but they don't recognize that part of what they need to do is understand why it's happening before they can take corrective action. So they just cycle through theories often that aggravate the issue because it is contributing to the cause and effect of the outcome that they don't want. I think if I just use a very sort of superficial example, let's say you're sending emails to your customer, you want them to buy stuff, they're not buying. So you go, ooh, maybe what we need to do is nudge them harder. So you send more emails, you get more aggressive, and the performance gets worse. And you're like, okay, we need to go harder. This sounds like madness on the face of it, but some version of this is occurring in, I would say, almost every business, certainly every business I've worked at. So I think part of what's good, especially in this climate, as horrible as it is that it is harder for businesses to try and brute force their way to progress because there's less money floating about. So we're seeing a move towards greater clarity, greater efficiency, etc. And I think a big part of what I do is, first of all, to kind of demonstrate the existing pains that are in a business because it is refusing to engage healthily and constructive with the process of experimentation. Like, okay, you've been banging your head against this wall, but you don't really understand what you're trying to do you? Here's why. And I find that usually opens things up to the idea that, okay, maybe if we've spent 3 years banging our head against this wall and not making progress, we don't want to spend another 3 years. Maybe it's worth us appreciating the value of insight and learning.
Yeah, I completely agree, and I also think as well that there is just an immense lack of skill in actually running experiments, and And it comes down to, I think, there's this big sort of chasm between what the word experimentation means. On the one hand, experimentation to people will mean an A/B test, which is completely confined to something that you can do in that software. It's confined to like user experience, and it requires statistics and things like that. And then the other meaning of experimentation, which is just sort of trying stuff to see what happens. And so a lot of businesses, they might have an idea, they might have a problem that they're trying to solve, but they've got those two solutions. So it's like maybe you can run a test, maybe you can't, like an A/B test. But otherwise, you're just kind of trying stuff. And I think the book Lean Startup has sort of popularized that a bit, where the lean startup talks about experimentation and pivoting off the back of experiments, but it says absolutely nothing whatsoever about how to actually run those experiments. And if you can't run an A/B test, you're left with people just sort of just vaguely doing stuff and trying to figure out what happened. And that's not a good way to run experiments. You wouldn't get scientists just going, oh, we'll just do it and kind of try and figure out what's going on. So I think there's a lack of process around it, and it's not necessarily massively complicated. It's there's some simple things like clearly stating what you believe in the first place, designing the experiment, planning and designing the experiment and how it's going to work, and how you're going to gather some kind of data off the back of it, and how you're going to interpret that data. And none of that needs to be an A/B test, but it just needs to have a little bit of careful planning around it, I guess, and things like that. So, I guess my question is, what kind of experiments constitute experiments? And how if something's quite general and can't be run as a statistically controlled A/B test, are there ways that you can, still have a bit of scientific approach around how you gather feedback from it?
100%. I think I'll start by stating one of the issues I think contributes greatly to the problem. You describe this reductive way of thinking about experimentation. I think it's incredibly common that people think that A/B testing is about certainty. I'm surprised at how many people don't realize that an A/B test, like most other things, just gives you a complex of probabilities that you can measure and control and then use to make decisions. People run an A/B test. Let's even assume process-wise you run it perfectly, and then you get an output. And they think, well, that means this is better. Not really. What it means is there is a set of probabilistic values that suggest you are better off going this way than that way, depending on what else you layer on top. So that's one issue. And as a result, A/B testing is treated as almost this sort of exemplification of experimentation, and nothing else matters. So that's one part of it. Separately, in terms of like what constitutes experimentation, I like to think more in terms of the conceptual ingredients you've listed there. You want to have a clear hypothesis. You want to have a way of measuring an outcome. You want to make sure your hypothesis is falsifiable, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And I think what is more important is that you essentially have an understanding of the world, and I think an empirical observation. I think this is where the scientific method comes in. Again, you have an empirical observation, you have hypotheses to underlie that. You design a way of testing those hypotheses, you design a way of measuring the outputs, and you formulate a method of interpreting the outputs of your measurement. None of that is about any specific method. And I think the other thing that often gets missed is you still need to interpret things. There's no getting away from that.
Yeah.
So, and when you're interpreting things, I think the context in which you're doing so matters. Like if I'm launching a new drug to treat cancer that could like poison 15 generations of humans if I get it wrong, the margin of error I'm going to tolerate in understanding exactly how that drug interacts is going to be very different, and should be, in my opinion, versus a situation where I want to test an email subject line to get people to, sign up for a webinar. Both those things are important in different contexts, but I think that element of judgment to say, what type of thing can I understand here? Sorry, am I trying to understand here? To what degree can it be understood? I think that's the other thing people miss. Like if you wanted to really understand which version of one web page is better than the other, you'd need to do a lot more than just run an A/B test on a website. You'd need to take in far more inputs about the market conditions, etc. So I think what's most important, just to bring it back, are those conceptual ingredients and an understanding of what it looks like to assemble them in a high quality way, what it looks like to form a high quality empirical observation, and then draw hypotheses that are clear, etc.
Yeah, I love the point about interpretation. It's something I talk about a lot because a lot of people have got themselves into the belief that A/B tests are sort of autonomous decisions, that it tells you what to do, that you run a test and then you get this binary thing that says yes, do it, no, don't. But that's really just bad faith. Like, ultimately you're making the decision off the back of it, whether or not you believe you are or not. But yeah, you. The other thing is there are a lot of other things to consider. So, even if you run a test and it demonstrates a positive improvement to a conversion rate or something like that, that's only one way of looking at something. Like, you've got brand, customer experience, competitive things, all sorts of stuff, things that you can't make into metrics, but nevertheless they're real. So in a way, the question is how well can we as humans synthesize all this information into making a better decision? And I think what people don't look at all is that the rational process of making decisions and improving our way of making decisions and understanding how decisions are made and how we can make more effective decisions. Just moving on to something a little bit different. So one of the advantages of the chief revenue officer and chief growth officer is being in a senior role is that the role ought to have the ability to create initiatives that are cross-functional across different areas of the business. And I think that's really exciting because in a lot of businesses can be incredibly siloed. I've worked in enormous companies before where I've been in product and I've never spoken to anybody in marketing in the whole time that I worked there. Things like that, and that's very common, particularly in big organizations. But what for you are the best ways to create coordination and collaboration across different areas that represent the different levers that you need to pull to drive revenue and growth, which could be product, could be customer, could be marketing, could be operations,
Yes, that's a really good question. So there are a few components. I think one is the construction of a compelling causal chain that spans multiple teams. You don't have to call it a causal chain. Maybe that sounds too abstract. But basically, one of the things I've observed is in companies, and as you said, it's probably more acute at bigger companies, although I find even in smaller companies it's quite common, is no one can really conceptualize the relationship between the things that are done in the business and the outcomes that the business wants, which sounds wild, but it's often true. So what ends up happening is, and I think maybe this is part of why sales professionals end up becoming chief revenue officers, is the only place where people can connect the dots is in sales, because the proximity and cause and effect they're so close together So someone talks to someone on the phone, they hand over money. So the mindset becomes all about sales. And even though, in a generic sense, if you said to someone, do you think that all these different teams in your company are contributing to acquiring customers and growing? They'd be like, yeah, of course. If you said, can you explain to me how they all fit together to drive that? They can't do it. So that's a real issue. So I think one of the most important things to do is to construct that causal chain using evidence, using data, using customer feedback, all these tools you have in your repository. To you had your TV interview moment. So I see that as a major part of my job. And then I think another thing is to find the common denominator. Because another thing that gets lost is, and this is why I said my experience writing has helped me, at least I think this is why I think this way, is that businesses often forget that I think of revenue as a side effect. You can't directly control it unless you scam people, which I would say a lot of businesses are actually scam adjacent, even though they don't mean to be. That is money that belongs to me. You want me to give it to you. And everything you're doing is to make that happen. If you're really lucky, you might get a really visionary CEO or founder who has a very compelling evidence-based view about how to make the world better, and that's what motivates them. But that's rarely the case. Often, businesses exist for very functional, practical reasons. Someone wants, financial freedom, or they have some knowledge, or they hate working for other people, or whatever it may be. And so it gets lost that actually this money coming in is a side effect of certain things happening with the customers. So finding ways to recenter that and go, look, everything that all of you are doing is for the purpose of creating a combined effect. Does he want to join in? So everything is about creating this combined effect, this combined experience, or this net experience for these people we call customers, and then helping everyone understand what that net effect is. I think it makes it easier to understand, okay, so I do this job to make it easier for these people to do that job, which makes it easier for these people to do that job. Like a simple example would be, all right, build a great product that is, focused on meeting customer needs so that it's easier for marketing to talk about it in a way that's compelling in the market, so that it's easier for salespeople. Very oversimplified version. But I think those two things are critical, and they are often completely missing in most companies, in my experience anyway.
Yeah, and I completely agree. And one of the things that I've always observed is absent from a lot of businesses I've worked in is the idea of a system that, I do a lot of kind of talking at the moment where I use the analogy of the Apollo space mission. And the Apollo space mission is like obviously very goal oriented. There was a very clear goal to it. But the program management of it would have been incredibly system oriented in the sense that, it starts out with that goal, and that goal has to be cascaded into different projects and teams that are doing things. And that program management would have been kind of all encompassing across the system, that you've got to have this person over here testing rocket propulsion and this person over here testing space suits and so on and so forth, and for all to be very coordinated. And that must have happened via a very kind of centralized system and a way of communicating that, which doesn't really happen in a lot of modern businesses. That what tends to happen is that it's about bringing in resources, creating teams, and making sure those teams understand what they want to do, and then trying to kind of develop culture that makes sure people are doing the right thing. So, what's your view on those kind of systems? And I mean, the translation of it for me in a business sense is that in one way, there should be some actual system, like a software system, that is tracking strategic initiatives, strategic objectives, cascading those down into different initiatives that people are working on, so that everybody understands how things kind of align. And it's very rare to see that. Like, what's your view on those kinds of systems, and whether they can work in that respect?
Yeah, that's a very good point. I think it's a more fundamental question than whether they can work. I think they are unavoidable, because I think what you're describing there is why certain types of people end up occupying the kinds of roles we occupy. I would hazard a guess that you have a very systemizing mind, and I am the same, hyper analytical, just thinking in systems, even outside of work. And I think what ends up happening is that software you describe ends up being a person in the company. That person is the algorithm that generates the system within the company. And I think it's important to recognize that, because it gives you a very specific understanding of what your role is within the team, which it's easy to miss. And sometimes I lose sight of it. You're trying to generate certain outcomes. You expect certain things to happen. They don't happen. And then you have to reflect and go, oh, wait, no, I'm the software. I'm the algorithm. So if I don't propagate the system, it will not be propagated. And because I would say this kind of extreme systemizing mindset is actually quite unusual. And so it's not like you're swimming with the current in a business. You're often swimming against it. So there's a natural tendency, as in the physical world, towards entropy. So unless you're applying quite a lot of effort, you will just regress. So I think it is necessary. I think in the absence of some software that can do this, which I don't know about, you often have to propagate that algorithm through tools like a vision and collaboration frameworks and timelines and standards and stuff like that. Those are all tools in the toolbox. And I think one of the things that's hard about playing this kind of role is people often want to use a generic framework or system, like, I don't know, the lean canvas or whatever it may be. In my experience, that rarely works. It actually, because each company in too many important ways is too idiosyncratic. So if you try and just like lift a framework, like if I went, oh, we did this at Facebook, so let me just lift that and do it at Charlie, it's not going to work. So there is a process of active engagement with the empirical realities of the business you're in. And then just like, I guess, with a computer algorithm, the same algorithm can produce different outputs depending on the context and the prompt. Not to dehumanize us too much, you have to give room for that. You have to allow your current business to prompt you so that your algorithm can produce the right kinds of systems. So that's how I see it. It's a person.
Yeah. And I think the other kind of the thing that goes part and parcel with systems is mental models of how people understand what the system is. And I've always found it very remarkable how people can have incredibly different mental models of how things work without really ever realizing it. And I've been in numerous businesses where, for example, I've been in product teams where, product people have read Marty Kagan books and understand the product operating model and believe that's how they should be working or are working. But then you've got wider stakeholders who just believe they're an IT function and they should be told, they should do what they're told and things like that. And nobody's ever actually had the conversation about what existentially is this function and how should it work and how should it work with stakeholders and things like that. And people don't necessarily have the I don't know, people aren't necessarily wired to kind of have those conversations and to think about how things work. There isn't a question off the back of that, just kind of a thought. But switching just to something a little bit different as well. Again, how do you? I mean, we've spoken before, and I look back and I noticed you we talked about the challenge of trying to balance these sort of rational approaches, experimentation, growth mindset, learning, with the real kind of rigors of things like aggressive sales targets and trading mentality and things like that. And similarly, I've been in positions where you can have all this very conceptually in your head, but then there are realities, like there are resources that have to be kept busy and things like that just present immediate pressures. So what are the kind of best ways that you found to try and balance those things, or to kind of sit in both worlds, I guess?
Yeah, I love these questions. I think the rational and emotional are often thought of as contrasting or in tension. The more I've experienced of life and the world, the more I think they're actually more like integrative and intertwined. And I think that goes to the heart of the question you're raising, because what often happens is you're caught between a world of trying to optimize things and also like dynamics between things, but also dynamics between people. And so if you go in with, let's say, for example, too much of a purist mindset, which I think tends to be a problem with experimentation professionals, they think that their job is to, at any cost, design the most profound and unimpeachable, let's say, A/B testing program ever. But then you have people over here who are like, yeah, I took 2 million from these investors. I said, we're going to hit these targets. What the fuck is going on? Sort of thing. And you get caught between. And I think actually that dichotomy doesn't need to exist. It creates an incredibly complex communication and collaboration job for, let's say, the chief revenue officer or an experimentation professional. But it's a very important job, which is this: to help your stakeholders understand that your goals are identical. That's super important. That the reason why, for example, I'm suggesting we talk to customers so we can form a more empirically accurate picture of what their problem is, and we can build a solution that addresses that, is not because I want to take longer. It's not because I want to be perfectionistic. It's because I want to make sure that we have the highest possible probability of achieving the outcomes we want. Now, my method isn't perfect, and I can concede some issues there. But what I'm trying to say to you, CEO, board member, whatever it may be, is all the other parts have a higher likelihood of taking us off track and not achieving the outcome that we want. I can't guarantee it, but we're going for the same thing. I'm just using a tool that is the best one within my toolbox for getting there. Now, there's obviously a lot of deeper layers to that, like the interplay of learning and earning and all that stuff. But I think that's the first bit, just like making sure we all feel like we're pushing for the same goal. I think what creates issues is when you have people on the business side thinking you're just messing around with your toys, not feeling the heat of needing to achieve certain goals. And then I think the other thing is, which can actually be fun if you reframe it this way, is to understand that in that dynamic, a lot of the time, you're not navigating an analytical system, you're navigating an emotional one. There's a sort of emotional interactivity happening. Someone feels anxious about the goal, but you feel anxious about setting setting up in a way that reduces the probability of achieving the goal. And now they're angry at you and you're angry. That's really what's happening. It's not really about whether or not your A/B test method or your experimentation method is set up robustly. So don't try and talk to them about that, which often is what happens. Recognize the context in which you are problem solving. And actually, I would say all the same tools in experimentation can be super useful, even when you're dealing with like an emotional issue. So I don't have a perfect answer. I still, from time to time, there'll be a period of acute desire, let's say, to get somewhere within the business. And that creates tension between me and other people. I think that's unavoidable from time to time. But what we can do is, I think, one, equip ourselves with the right tools to create alignment that, hey, we're trying to do the same thing. And then two, engage in problem solving within the right context.
Yeah. I've always looked at it as, I think that there's two very different sides to any business. Like there's the customer side and the shareholder side. And when people come up through marketing teams or whatever, they're only really kind of exposed to the customer side. But the more senior you get, the more you become exposed to the shareholder side and the demands of finance and things like that. And it's quite interesting to just realize the pressures that that side of the business has, and that's very different from trying to develop products really well and things like that. And they don't always go hand in hand, which is unfortunate, but they don't. Well, we're up to time. Timi, thank you so much. It's been absolutely fascinating talking to you. I love to speak to people that have that kind of philosophical mind. I did philosophy myself at university, so I can tell you a really great way of thinking about these things and analysing these things. So really super interesting. And thank you so much for joining. And yeah, hope everyone watching has had a good time. So yeah, thanks so much. And we will see you on next week's show.
Thanks, Johnny. My pleasure.